The corridor at Ashcroft Park was lit by a single lamp at its far end, and the light it threw was thin enough that Cecily Morrow could have passed the locked gallery door without noticing it, except that someone had left a candle burning on the other side. She saw it first as a strip of gold at the floor, barely the width of a finger, running the length of the door's base. She had been at Ashcroft for 3 days, long enough to learn from the housemaids that the gallery at the corridor's midpoint was never opened. The old Earl had locked it before he died, they said, and the new one had kept it so. No portraits came in or out. No one cleaned inside. The key lived, they supposed, in the study, though none of them had ever seen it used. Cecily stood in the corridor and looked at the ribbon of candlelight. She could hear faintly the sound of papers being turned, a methodical sound unhurried, the sound of a man who has been at a task for some time and does not expect to finish soon. She knew without looking that it was Edmund Vane, the Earl of Ashcroft, and she knew it not because she had recognized some quality of his movements, but because the housemaids had also told her that no one else in the house went to that corridor after dark. She stood for perhaps half a minute longer than she should have. Then she turned and walked back to the east wing, and a candle in her own room, and the small desk where she was supposed to be writing a letter to Lady Vane's niece in Bristol. And she told herself that the locked gallery and whatever it held inside were not her business, and had never been her business, and would not become so. She was wrong about that last part. She did not yet know how wrong. The county of Northamptonshire had made up its mind about Cecily Morrow before she was old enough to understand that minds had been made up. Her father, George Morrow, of Morrow Cottage, had married her mother in the spring of 1790, at St. Enny, Crispin's church in the village of Enderby, and for 11 years the marriage had been unremarkable in every way that mattered, being private, steadfast, productive of one daughter, and a great deal of quiet, mutual regard. Then her mother died of a fever in the summer of 1801, and her father died of a broken heart that moved slowly and called itself a chest ailment. And in the year after his death, the Hartwell family produced a solicitor and a claim. The claim ran as follows. George Morrow had been previously married, in Scotland, in the year 1788, to a woman named Anne Rennie of Edinburgh. If that marriage had existed, Cecily's mother had been a bigamist. If her mother had been a bigamist, their marriage had no legal force. Well, if their marriage had no legal force, Cecily had no legitimate name to claim, no standing before the law, and no inheritance from her father, which passed instead, by an obscure entailment, to a Hartwell cousin named Mr. Cobley. Frederick Prentice, who now lived in Morrow Cottage, and kept dogs in the front parlor. There had been no Scottish marriage. Cecily was as certain of this as she was certain of her own name. Her father had told her in the last months of his life, with a clarity and a grief that did not belong to a guilty man. He had never been to Edinburgh. He had never known anyone named Anne Rennie. The claim was a fabrication arranged to serve the Hartwell debt interest, and every person in the county who had known George Morrow well knew it was a fabrication, and every person in the county who had not known him well found it convenient to accept. The label had attached to her the season. Her father died. She had been 17. She heard it first in a drawing room at Fentham Hall, where she had gone with her father's solicitor to discuss the estate's situation, and a woman near the window had spoken in a low voice to her companion, low enough that she was not certain she was meant to hear, but not so low that Cecily did not hear. She had been hearing it since. Lady Hartwell herself had said it in Cecily's hearing, 3 weeks before the Ashcroft engagement, said it in the bright, impersonal voice of a woman stating a weather condition. It was at the Fentham Assembly Rooms, and Cecily had been standing beside Mrs. Alderton, the woman she then accompanied as a paid companion, when Lady Hartwell swept past with her daughter on one arm and her cousin, Mr. Prentice, on the other. She did not lower her voice. She said it the way one confirms a fact to a friend who had forgotten. She is a natural daughter. Whatever air she gives herself, the room did not react. That was the worst of it. The room did not react because it had heard the claim often enough that it no longer registered as an insult. It had become, in the county's collective understanding, simply a description. Cicely had looked straight ahead and said nothing, and let the moment pass through her without visible consequence, because she had learned to do this, because it was the only skill the last 7 years had given her that she had not asked for. If the courage it took to do that moved you, I hope you will stay with this story. It does not end here. She came to Ashcroft Park at the invitation of Lady Vane, who was Edmund's great-aunt and the female authority of the household, and who had known Cecily's mother, and claimed, with the authority of age, to feel some obligation to Cecily on that account. The obligation translated into a 3-month engagement as Lady Vane's companion, taking the place of a girl who had gone to nurse a sick relation. Cecily was grateful for the work, and careful not to be more than grateful, because she had learned that gratitude offered too openly could be mistaken for need, and need made people uncomfortable, and discomfort curdled into avoidance, and she could not afford to be avoided. The Earl of Ashcroft. She had met twice before in her life, once at a neighbor's dinner when she was 12 and he was 24 visiting from London with his uncle, and once at her father's funeral when he had stood at the back of the churchyard with his hat in his hands and said nothing to her at all. She did not know what to make of those 2 occurrences taken together, and she did not try. She was assigned a room in the east wing, pleasant room with 2 windows overlooking the kitchen garden, where the last of the autumn cabbages made a neat row against the frost. Lady Vane informed her of her duties. She was to read aloud in the mornings, accompany Lady Vane on visits to the tenants in the afternoons, and be available in the drawing room in the evenings when company called. She was not, Lady Vane said, to trouble the Earl with domestic matters. The Earl had his own concerns. She kept those instructions. She was good at keeping instructions. She had been keeping instructions for 7 years. The library at Ashcroft Park was on the ground floor in the north wing, and it ran floor to ceiling with books, in the serious leather-backed manner of libraries that had been assembled by people who actually read the books. Cecily found it on her second morning when she was looking for a volume Lady Vane had requested, and she found the volume, and she stood in the middle of the room for a moment longer than efficiency required, because the smell of old paper, and the quality of the light coming through the north-facing windows, and the particular silence of a room that had been used for thinking rather than sociability, produced in her a sensation she could only describe as relief. She was standing at the shelves when Edmund Vane came in. He stopped in the doorway. She did not hear him stop so much as feel it, a change in the quality of the air, a weight of attention directed at her that was not hostile but was not casual. She turned. He was taller than she had remembered. She did not know why that surprised her. He had the build of a man who had been athletic and had not entirely relinquished the habit of it, and he wore his dark coat with the ease of someone accustomed to it rather than performing it. His face was composed in a way that she had seen in men who had been taught early. That composure was the only acceptable state, and his eyes, when they settled on her, were gray and entirely unreadable. "Miss Morrow," he said. "My lord," she said, "I am searching for a volume for Lady Vane. A History of Northamptonshire by Mr. Bridges. Lady Vane believed it was here." "Second shelf from the left," he said, "near the window." He did not move from the doorway. "Use the library whenever you wish. No one will trouble you here." It was not warmly said. The words were plain and correct, and carried no more heat than a household directive about meal times. She thanked him and found the Bridges and left, and did not allow herself to think about the particular way he had said the last sentence. No one will trouble you here, as though he were making a guarantee on behalf of all comers, rather than granting a permission she had not asked for. His eyes had stayed on her as she moved toward the door. She knew it without looking. The back of her neck knew it, and her shoulders, and the hand that held the book a degree more carefully than necessary. She told herself this meant nothing. She had learned to tell herself useful things. It was the 3rd week of November when the matter of the housemaid came to a head. The girl's name was Martha, and she was 17, and had been at Ashcroft for 2 years, and she had committed the offense of breaking a china jug that had belonged to Lady Vane's mother. And Lady Vane, in the specific way of women whose composure was made of stiffer material than affection, had decided that Martha was to be turned off without a character. This was, in Lady Vane's judgment, the correct response to carelessness. China that had traveled from Bath in 1779 was not a thing one broke without consequence. Cecily heard about it from the housekeeper, who told her in a tone of resigned expectation, and she thought about it for 10 minutes and then went to Lady Vane's sitting room and said, with all the quiet she could manage, that she hoped Lady Vane might reconsider. Lady Vane looked at her with the pale blue eyes that she used as an instrument of measurement. "The jug was my mother's," she said. "Yes," Cecily said. "And Martha has no mother and no family in a position to take her in. A character from Ashcroft is the difference between decent work and none. The jug was an accident. I do not think we can call it a character fault." Lady Vane's fan opened and closed once. "I did not ask your opinion on the matter, Miss Morrow." "No?" Cecily said. "You did not. She did not move." The silence between them was of the quality that precedes a sentence being revised, rather than a battle being won, and Cecily had the grace not to mistake one for the other. She did not know that Edmund had come to the door of the sitting room during the middle of this exchange. She did not know that he stood in the corridor outside the open door for the full length of what followed, and that he watched her with the stillness of a man who has forgotten to breathe. She did not know that when Lady Vane, after a silence of some 30 seconds, said that perhaps the matter could be reviewed, and perhaps a written warning might serve in place of a dismissal, Edmund turned and walked back down the corridor before she could see him. She did not know any of this. She thanked Lady Vane and left, and went about the rest of her day. Martha kept her position. Cecily noticed the following morning that when she came to breakfast, the Earl had left a book at her place, a newer volume than she had noticed on the library shelves, a collection of essays she had not seen before. There was no note. She did not assume it was intentional. She read it anyway, and found it excellent. She was in the corridor outside the portrait gallery the following afternoon, accompanying Lady Vane on her weekly inspection of the house's upper rooms, when Edmund fell into step beside them. Lady Vane showed no surprise, which told Cecily the visit had been planned, and she adjusted her expectations accordingly, and followed without question. The portrait gallery occupied the full length of the north corridor on the first floor. It was handsomely proportioned, with plasterwork ceilings and the Ashcroft family ranged along both walls, from the first Earl in his ruff to Edmund's father in a coat that was already unfashionable by the standards of 20 years ago. Edmund walked with his hands behind his back and named each portrait for Lady Vane without consulting a note, the way a man who has spent considerable time in a room names what is in it. He spoke to Lady Vane. He did not address Cecily directly. She noticed the inner door at the gallery's end, and it was set into the wall with less ceremony than she had imagined from the corridor below. A plain door painted the same cream as the walls, with an iron lock that was newer than the door itself. A fresh lock, she thought. Changed within the last few years. "What is through there?" she asked. She had not meant to ask it aloud. It arrived without permission, the way honest questions do when one has been too long disciplined in suppression. Lady Vane looked at her. Edmund turned from the portrait he had been describing and looked at her too, and for a moment the quality of his attention was something other than polite. "The inner room," he said. "It is not in use." "It has a new lock," she said. She did not know why she pursued it. She watched his face. A muscle moved at his jaw. "Just once," he said carefully. "There are things in that room I do not yet have the right to give you." He said it low enough that Lady Vane, whose hearing was not what it had been, did not catch it. His eyes did not leave hers. She could not interpret it. She held it for a moment like a letter written in a hand she had not learned to read, and then she nodded, because it was the only response she could make that would not require her to say aloud that she did not understand. She thought about it that evening instead. She thought about it with a persistence that surprised her, because she was not, as a rule, a woman who gave her mind over to things that did not yield. She thought about the new lock, and the careful way he had said the sentence, and the way he had not looked away. and the way the sentence had not been an answer at all. What she did not know was this. He had, in the 4th week after his uncle's death 4 years ago, found a sealed box inside the locked gallery that his uncle had left in a specific location, described in a separate letter, addressed to Edmund alone. The box contained 2 things. The first was a sealed copy of the marriage lines of George Morrow and Eleanor Stanton entered in the register of Sing Sing, Crispin's church in Enderby, in the spring of 1790, certified by the vicar and witnessed by 2 men who had since died, but whose signatures remained clear. The second was a letter from the previous Earl, and it was not a confession so much as a calculation. He had known of the Hartwell claim's falseness. He had obtained the register evidence. He had not used it because using it would have required him to expose the debt structure that the Hartwell claim had protected, a debt structure in which the Ashcroft estate was itself entangled. He had locked the documents away and died. Edmund had read the letter twice, and then set it aside and not touched it for a week. In the 4 years since he had done 3 things. He had quietly disentangled the Ashcroft estate from the Hartwell debt. He had retained a solicitor in London, a Mr. Caswell, with instructions to authenticate the register copy and prepare a legal opinion on the document's admissibility. And he had not, in those 4 years, found a way to put the information before her that would not risk the document's validity being challenged before they could be legally deployed. He had thought about it as a legal problem. He had not, until she came to stand in his library, holding a book about Northamptonshire history, allowed himself to think about it as anything else. There are moments when a story turns, and the audience knows it before the people inside the story do. I hope you are still here for this one. The formal dinner was Lady Vane's annual obligation to the neighboring families, held in the last week of November, when the roads were still passable and before the serious cold set in. Cecily had helped arrange it for 3 days, arranging the flowers, the writing of cards, the consultation with the cook about the second course, and she found in the work a steadiness she was grateful for, because the work required her full attention and gave her nothing left over for thinking about iron locks and sentences she could not decode. Lady Hartwell was not, strictly speaking, a neighbor. She lived 12 miles off. Lady Vane had known her for 40 years and kept the connection, and so Lady Hartwell arrived with her daughter Miss Arabella Hartwell and her cousin, Frederick Prentice, and they were shown into the drawing-room with the fire and the candlelight and the smell of hothouse roses that Cecily had arranged that morning. Cecily felt Lady Hartwell notice her the way one feels a change in temperature. She stood near the window and she was careful and she was still, and she did not permit herself to look at Edmund, who was on the other side of the room and who had, she noticed without looking, gone very quiet since the Hartwells arrived. Mr. Prentice spoke before dinner. He found her at the window with the direct confidence of a man who has never been required to doubt his right to address anyone, and he said, not quietly, not as an aside, in the voice of a man reciting a fact to a room, but, Miss Morrow is a natural daughter and the law recognizes her as nothing. I am always surprised when people lose sight of this. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the small cluster of guests beside her, none of whom said anything because none of them disagreed out loud. She kept her face even. She had kept it even for 7 years, and she could keep it for the length of one dinner. She kept it even through the first course and the second, and through Miss Hartwell's demonstration at the pianoforte, which was accomplished and which Edmund applauded with the correct degree of attention that told Cecily nothing. She kept it even when Lady Vane drew Edmund aside near the fireplace at the hour's end and said, in the carrying whisper of a woman who believed she was being discreet, "The county has decided, Edmund. A natural daughter cannot be received here indefinitely. I am doing my best, but the Hartwells are not without influence, and you must consider what a continued association will cost you." She did not say Cecily's name. She did not need to. Edmund said nothing that Cecily heard. When Lady Vane announced 20 minutes later that Lord Ashcroft would escort Miss Hartwell through the remainder of the evening's entertainment, Cecily had no expression to change because she had already arranged her face for a different country entirely. She watched Edmund offer his arm. She watched Miss Hartwell take it. She was very good at watching without her hands shaking, and they did not shake. She left the drawing room at the first decent interval, and walked to the east wing, and sat on the edge of her bed, and looked at the window, where the garden below was dark, and the first frost of the season had laid itself across the cabbage rows in a thin silver line. She made a decision. It was not the first decision she had made from a position of exhaustion, and it was made the same way as all the others, quietly and practically, and without self-pity. She would finish out the week and then tell Lady Vane that she was needed elsewhere. There was no elsewhere. She would invent one. She had a few pounds saved. She would return to Mrs. Gerberd, Alderton, who had always been decent to her, and she would resume the work of being decent in return and expect nothing and receive approximately nothing, and be grateful for what small portions the county saw fit to extend to a natural daughter, with no name and no property and no claim to either. She did not cry. She had been a long time past the kind of grief that required tears. This was the quieter kind, the kind that settles in the chest like a stone placed carefully rather than thrown. She packed the smallest of her bags. Not entirely. She was not so given to drama as to pack everything, but she put her extra ribbon and the miniature of her mother and the 2 good handkerchiefs at the top, where she could find them quickly in the morning. She went to look for her cloak, and passed in the corridor, the gallery door. The key was in the lock. Not just hanging in the lock, but turned. The door slightly ajar, a candle lit somewhere beyond it. She stood and looked at the key and the door and the thin line of light. She did not know what Edmund had intended by this, whether it was an invitation or a carelessness, or whether she was projecting meaning onto a coincidence because she wanted there to be meaning. She had been doing that, she suspected, for several weeks. She did not go in. She stood with her hand near the door, and then she did not open it, because whatever was inside was not hers to take, and she had never taken what was not hers to take, and she was not going to begin now. She went to her room. She did not sleep. She was at breakfast the following morning, alone, when she heard the drawing-room door open across the hall. The dinner guests had been arranged to stay the night, given the season and the distance, and they were presumably still in their rooms. The hour was early. Cecily was concentrating on her tea and her resolve, and trying not to think about the key in the gallery door, and so it took her a moment to understand the quality of the voices she was hearing. Not the low conversational murmur of a household waking, but something more deliberate. A gathering sound, a sound of people being assembled. She set down her cup. She rose. She went to the drawing-room door. The room held 7 people. Lady Vane was in her chair beside the fire, upright in the specific way of a woman who has been surprised and is not going to show it. Lady Hartwell and her daughter were on the sofa. Mr. Prentice was standing near the window. 2 other guests, whose names Cecily had not retained, occupied the chairs between, and the Earl of Ashcroft was standing at the center of the room. He was holding a document. He had clearly been standing there for some time before Cecily arrived, because the quality of attention in the room was already at full height, the way a room looks when something has just been said that has reorganized it. Lady Hartwell's hand was very still on her fan. Mr. Prentice was looking at the document in a way that suggested he recognized it. Edmund looked at Cecily in the doorway. Something moved in his face. Not relief exactly, though that was the closest word she had. Permission, perhaps. The face of a man who has been waiting to do a thing and has now found the moment to do it. "Come in, Miss Morrow," he said. "Please." She came in. He turned to the room. He said it simply and without theater, in the level voice of a man making a statement of fact that he expects to be understood on the first hearing. He looked at Lady Hartwell when he said it, and then at Mr. Prentice, and then, briefly, at Lady Vane. He did not look at Cecily. "She is legitimate," he said. "I have held the proof 4 years." The silence that followed was of a specific quality, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a room rearranging its understanding of what it thought it knew. Mr. Prentice's face went the color of old plaster. Lady Hartwell looked at the document the way a person looks at evidence they had convinced themselves could not exist. Edmund set the document on the writing table beside him. he said beside it a second document, this one sealed and signed in a hand, none of them recognized, and he said that the second document was the authentication of the marriage register copy by Mr. Caswell, a solicitor of Gray's Inn, who had examined the original St. Crispin's register in the company of the current vicar of Enderby 3 weeks ago, and confirmed the entry's validity. He said it in the same voice one uses to read a household account, precise and thorough and complete. He said that the prior Earl's entanglement with the Hartwell debt claim was a matter of record now concluded, and that the claim itself had had no legal foundation. He said this without cruelty and without triumph, and Lady Hartwell, who had arrived the previous evening in command of every room she entered, sat on the sofa and did not seem to know what her hands were doing. Mr. Prentice said, "This will require review," and Edmund said, "It has had 4 years of review, Mr. Prentice. Mr. Caswell is available to speak to you this afternoon if you wish." He did not raise his voice. He had no need to. Lady Vane said nothing for a long moment. She sat with her ivory fan open in her lap, and she looked at the document on the writing table, and she looked at Cecily, and whatever calculation moved behind her pale blue eyes resolved itself into something quieter. "I see," she said finally. It was not an apology. It was what passed in Lady Vane's vocabulary. For one, Cecily was standing just inside the doorway. She had not moved since she entered. She was aware of her hands, which were very still at her sides, and of her face, which she was keeping even from long practice, and of the peculiar vertiginous quality of a moment in which something has been true for years and has only now arrived. Edmund crossed the room. Not to the window, not to the table, not to Lady Vane. He crossed the room to the doorway where she stood, and he stopped in front of her, near enough that she could see the thin scar across his left brow, and the gray that had collected at his temples, and the precise way he held himself when he was not going to permit himself to look away. He said quietly, for her alone, "I am sorry it took this long. The documents were not ready to produce safely before now. I would not risk them for anything shorter than certainty." He paused. "I should have told you they existed. I did not know how to tell you without telling you what my uncle had done, and I did not know how to tell you that without telling you what I had not done." Quickly enough, she looked at him. She said with the directness that came into her voice when her values were engaged, "You locked them in the gallery to protect them." "Yes, and you changed the lock when you inherited." 3 months after," he said. When I understood what I had found, she thought about the candle under the door. She thought about 4 years of a man sitting with documents he could not yet use and a wrong he could not yet right. She thought about the sentence he had said at the gallery threshold. "There are things in that room I do not yet have the right to give you," and she understood it now with a clarity that rearranged her chest. "Show me," she said. The gallery's inner room was smaller than she had expected, not a room so much as a deep alcove off the main gallery, lined on 3 sides with shelves of document boxes, the kind of organized archiving that belonged to an estate's legal history, rather than its aesthetic one. Edmund held the candle and she followed him in. And she looked at the shelves, and then she looked at the wall. Her mother looked back at her. The miniature was hung just above the top shelf on a small hook, in a plain gold frame no larger than a man's palm, and it depicted a young woman of perhaps 20, with dark auburn hair and hazel eyes, and a small mouth set in an expression that was not quite a smile but was the thing just before one. It had been painted in the early style of the period, with the pale background and the slight formality of a sitting done for a purpose, and the purpose had been a friendship. Cecily's mother in the year of her marriage had given her godfather a likeness. The godfather had locked it here, his nephew had kept it safe. Cecily stood and looked at her mother's face for a long time. She did not speak. There were things that did not require speech, and this was one of them. Edmund stood beside her and was quiet, and she was grateful for that too. After a while, she reached up and lifted the miniature from its hook, and it was lighter than she expected, and she held it in both hands, the way one holds something that has been missing long enough that its return is not quite credible yet. "She sat for this in the spring of 1790, Edmund said. "According to my uncle's records, the same spring as the marriage." "The same spring," Cecily said. There was a quality to the room around them, the cold air and the candlelight and the rows of sealed boxes, that made ordinary speech feel insufficient, and so neither of them attempted more of it than was necessary. He did not tell her what she must have been feeling. She did not perform it for his observation. They stood in the small room with her mother's face between them and the marriage lines. On the shelf behind them, and the morning light from the outer gallery crept slowly toward the door. She thought about her father, who had gone to his grave believing himself publicly shamed by a claim he could not refute. She thought about 7 years of keeping her face, even while the county made its comfortable, careless judgments. She thought about what it meant that those judgments had been wrong not from ignorance, but from the deliberate suppression of the truth. And then, because her father had taught her that what has been endured must eventually be set down, she let herself stop thinking about it and looked instead at Edmund's face. He was watching her. He had been watching her. She understood now for considerably longer than 3 weeks. "The cottage," she said. "Morrow Cottage. If the marriage is confirmed, the entailment to the Hartwells is invalid," he said. "Mr. Caswell is already in correspondence with the county solicitor. It will take some months, but the property is yours." He hesitated. "There is also the matter of your father's other assets, which were absorbed into the Hartwell claim, and should not have been. Caswell will pursue those as well." She stood with this information and felt it settle into her in layers, the way warmth settles into a body that has been cold for a very long time. "That is more than I had any reason to expect," she said. "No," he said. "It is exactly what you should have had 4 years ago." The quiet between them shifted. She was aware of him, with the particular bodily awareness she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks. The warmth of him near her arm, the gray of his eyes in the candlelight, the controlled stillness of a man who had a great deal he was not saying, and was choosing not to say it yet. He chose to say one part of it. "I would ask," he said, in the same level voice he had used in the drawing room, except that it was not level now in the same way. "When matters are settled, when Caswell had completed his work and the cottage was returned to you, and she had had time to take stock of her situation, he would ask whether she might permit him to call on her." He paused. "Not as the Earl of Ashcroft, calling on a neighbor as a man who has been paying inadequate attention to his obligations and wishes to do better." She looked at him for a moment. "You have been paying considerable attention to your obligations. The problem is that you paid them in a locked room where no one could see you do it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the thing, just before one. It was the same expression her mother had in the miniature, and she thought that perhaps there were some things that recognized each other across time without needing to be introduced. "Yes," he said. "I will try to do better on that point as well." She looked down at the miniature in her hands. Her mother, 20 years old and recently married, sitting for a portrait in the spring before everything had been decided. She had known something, that morning, that had settled her face into that almost smile. She had known herself loved and her marriage real and her future open. And she had sat for the portrait with the ease of a woman who had not yet been required to defend any of it. Cecily intended to earn that ease. She tucked the miniature into her palm and turned toward the door, and Edmund held the candle. The winter light of Ashcroft Park filled the outer gallery ahead of them, cold and clear, and entirely without question. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Caswell completed his work with the thoroughness of a man who had been retained by a client who would accept nothing less. The Hartwell claim against the Morrow estate was formally withdrawn by the county solicitor. In the 3rd week of December, the relevant legal instruments signed and recorded at the county registry without ceremony. Frederick Prentice vacated Morrow Cottage on the 6th of January, having accepted a settlement that Edmund's solicitor characterized as generous, and Cecily privately considered adequate. Lady Vane said nothing further on the subject of natural daughters. She developed, over the course of those weeks, a habit of asking Cecily's opinion on small household matters. And while it was not an apology, Lady Vane did not apologize. She adjusted her assessments and proceeded. and it was what apology looked like when offered by a woman of 70 with considerable pride and a growing suspicion that she had been wrong. Cecily accepted it in the spirit it was offered and did not press the matter further. Edmund called on her at Morrow Cottage in the 3rd week of January, on a morning when the frost had not yet melted from the kitchen garden, and the parlor smelled of the beeswax she had applied to the newly returned furniture. He sat across from her in the chair that had been her father's, and they had tea, and he told her about the portraits in the gallery, and she told him about her mother's letters, which had been returned to her along with the cottage, and which she had not yet been able to read all the way through. And he listened in the manner of a man who had decided that listening was his primary occupation for the foreseeable future. He asked her when the tea was finished and the fire was low whether she had given any further thought to his request. He meant the request from the gallery, though he did not specify this, because they were at the point of their understanding where specification was not required. She said that she had given it a great deal of thought, and had decided that a man who had sat in a locked room for 4 years protecting her family's truth had earned the right to be heard with some seriousness. He said that he was glad to hear it, and that he intended to make his feelings clear in the appropriate form at the appropriate time, and that in the meantime he hoped she would understand that what he felt was not gratitude for her patience with the matter, and not admiration for her public composure, and not regard for her qualities, though it was all of those things, but something prior to all of those things, and not reducible to any of them. She understood what he meant. She had understood it, she suspected, since the morning he left a book at her breakfast place, without a note. "You may call again on Thursday, my lord," she said. He said that he would. She sat by the window after he had gone and looked at the frost on the kitchen garden and at the lane where his horse had turned toward Ashcroft Park, and she held her mother's miniature in her palm, and looked at the face in it. Her mother young and certain in the year. She had been married and known it, and sat for a portrait with the ease of a woman who had not yet needed to fight for what she had. The miniature was smaller than she had thought when she first lifted it from the wall. It fit entirely within one hand, which meant it was always precisely the right size to carry. The frost lay white and even on the garden. The parlor fire settled, and breathed. She had a home. She had a name. She had, for the first time in 7 years, the sensation of the future arranged in front of her, in orderly prospect, rather than anxious uncertainty. She set the miniature on the mantel, her mother's face in the plain gold frame, looking out at the room she had once lived in, and she did not move it again. If Cecily's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. There are more waiting, and they are all about the women the world decided not to see, until someone did.